Next speaker is Michael Vinarcik.
Mike is a director at SAIC and president of the Michigan and Cozy chapter, and an adjunct professor at the University of Detroit Mercy, licensed professional engineer with 35 years of experience. And I've worked with Mike over the years, and he is one of those people that accepts only awesomeness, and that's something I highly respect. So, unfortunately, he missed the comments because he was just in the room. But Mike, did you heard me say that? I appreciate your only tolerance of awesomeness, and I hope to do the same.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be here, and thanks to Sensmetry for inviting me to speak. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about lessons I learned from teaching SysML at CEDESI in Mexico City. So yeah, again, obviously we're trying to teach systems as code. Again, it's not a drawing tool, it's textual and code-like. We have to teach the language and the craft together. We have to teach the students the notation and the discipline of modeling at the same time, which is non-trivial. And again, typically the diagrams follow the text. In the old days, it was, draw a box on ramp is gone. So we have to worry about that. So how do we teach notation and good modeling judgment at the same time? And again, I like to use a lot of forged and fire references, and bladesmiths have metallurgy tools and proven best practices, and they still make a lot of blunders. So how can we avoid that? So the hope is that by teaching two tools side by side, we can make the language and method visible in the way one tool can't. And so we'll take a look at how we did that. So we use Seaside, obviously our Seaside Cloud, text first, no install, opens instantly, lots of good stuff going on, Git-friendly text models. And again, we've got the read-only visualization, and then Cameo, CATIA Magic, which I'm known to have a little familiarity with. Again, diagram first, we're able to draw, reorder, connect, and synchronize. It's a little more familiar MBSC workflow for those of us that are used to working those tools. But there's also a heavier setup, and the community build does give some text access, though. So again, feedback from the students was that opening an account in Seaside was easy. The overall experience was designed to be user-friendly. It was a little heavier to get the CATIA Magic installed. No surprise there. And so if we look at this, teaching the language is a little easier nowadays. You have part def, part, so there's a lot more consistency internally, which helps a lot. And the text first teaching does force you to confront that. The notation with our diagrams, tables, matrices. Again, diagram first does help with some aspects of making the architecture legible. So I was happy to see her speaking about, the ability to understand the model is really important as well. Then we have to teach our method, right? This is the one thing that the modeler really controls, and that every element has a cost. How do we find efficient ways to develop our models? So if we get the language and tool right, or once you pick the language and tool, method is all that you have left to influence, which is why it's so critically important that we work out good, thoughtful ways to use SysML 2. And so the sixth homework I had was to set up the environments, understand the core concepts, make the system models, and compare the approaches. And so they got Seaside and Cameo stood up. They had to do the advent of SysML 2 from Seaside. So thanks, gang, for making that applicable and available. Everybody can understand Santa Claus, right? So that helps a lot. And then we were able to compare things between the two tools, what was easier, what was harder, et cetera. And so, and we did allow a little bit of AI. Obviously, you guys have the assistants. The students called it cloud code, but they were allowed to use that as well. And so the intent was, again, get the structure for sequencing, get the behavior modeling done. And then, again, we had Santa's sleigh with Christmas operations, which again is a fairly low stakes, memorable, and it keeps the focus on the language. They did provide the task-based videos that helped a lot. And then we had this weekly cadence where they were building the models week over week. And so 15 days, one growing model, they were able to do quite a bit here, learning a lot about the attributes that Seaside had baked into the example. Again, nice tight code, a lot of information here that was able to be put forth. So again, my hat's off to them for doing that. So things we learned, text first in practice, the no install worked great, live validation, easy navigation, lots of good stuff going on. But it was a little steep for non-programmers. I was telling Mark earlier, I'm a grumpy old man. I've pushed things a lot just by using built-in things in the tool. I don't want to be writing code, though. These guys are really working hard to get me to warm up to that. So we'll see how that goes. But one syntax error can halt things. There was some corruption apparently with diagram exports. There were a couple minor issues, and I'm sure that as the tools mature, that'll go away. So again, they found it was easier to do the interface amenities, but again, there were some problems where they couldn't open up the file format. On the Cameo side of the house, again, drag, draw, connect, the visual modeling, the usual metaphor that a lot of us are used to worked well. They got the diagram to text round tripping, really nice image exporting and the familiar workflow, but had a much harder setup, some licensing confusion. One of the students had a Java problem. I mean, we had, the typical speed bumps you get installing a heavier client. And so, student A had reported this install error, which is kind of unfortunate. So side by side, we found a lot of goodness here, instant open and type, you can see the syntax errors can stop you on the other hand, so lots of things going on, but in general, they were able to find success with both tools, which I was happy with. So, part of this, I think we're moving to a world where people are going to be switching between tools regularly to play to the strengths of each. And I think that's a microcosm of what we saw here. So in the own words from the students, the workflow was model-centric and tree-based, which made them think about structure before visualization. I'm pretty sure they're talking about Cameo there. In SysML 2, you can't just draw stuff randomly. You've got to define things in the correct order, which really helped them drive and understand building the definitions and not drawings, which again is something I've been harping on for a long time. So I was happy to see that soaking in. That the main challenge was understanding the language because they didn't have a programming background. So for some people, that may be a heavier lift. And defining something on C side without knowing program took them a few hours to understand. But again, the whole point is to get them to learn. And by the way, some of the English is a little off. These are students in Mexico, so forgive the minor misspellings in that. They did feel that after they had worked in Seaside, it was a lot easier to work in Cameo because they understood the language better. So I think it's really powerful. Again, we're going to see people shifting between multiple tools again, in my opinion. And so what this finally taught us, fight the text first. They felt that if they wrestled the language text-wise, they understood it better. But then being able to see the diagrams well made it legible at a glance. And I know Seaside's working with Tom Sawyer and other people to provide the language visualizations, which is really important. So again, the overwhelming consensus was text first, learning the language, but diagram first helps to communicate the design. And so again, just lots more feedback. And again, I'm sure these slides will be made available to the attendees. So. Other lessons I learned with the environment, one of the challenges I had, there is the setup friction. It did suck up a lot of time. The low on-ramp does pay off with the zero install instant workspace, which is nice. The rough edges do erode the trust a little bit, but we got over that. And again, finding that the stressful task, setting up Cameo and that and other things. So again, and unfortunately, a lot of students don't understand my bedrock rule of just have your own damn laptop. So fighting with company lockdowns and install stuff, I'm a simple guy. I don't need that kind of background noise. But again, sometimes you run into that. So finally, as I know we're running short on time here, we did let them use the assistants. The LLMs are a legitimate tool, and the study aids work pretty well. But there is this programming gap. Again, you got to be really careful what you're doing with the text-based notation, and you want to make sure you don't drift. So we have to be careful about that. And so they did find some frustrations with using the cloud code. They thought sometimes it modified ways they didn't necessarily like, but they were getting better at it. So again, we'll find better ways to do that. So if you do a dual tool approach, I do recommend use text first to teach the language. Pre-stage the hard install. It'll make things a lot easier. Make sure you make your methods explicit. Teach the discipline, not just the syntax. Treat the built-in tools as a way to aid the apprentice. And I will say this, while I'm one of my favorite people, I do occasionally ignore my own advice. And I said years ago that you shouldn't teach something unless you have really good experience yourself personally. And I was a little short on the tool proficiency myself. I haven't done a lot with the 2026X implementation of SysML 2 and Cameo, and I don't have as much time in VS Code with Seaside as I would like. So that didn't help. I didn't have a Teamwork Cloud to help me, so that was deficient in terms of reviewing the Cameo models. I didn't have GitHub running either for the VS Code stuff. So I think having a good collaboration environment is critical. And again, I still don't have good automated validation yet, so I'm missing out on this immediate feedback loop to teach people and give them feedback. So here's the real problem. And this is something that came out of my NARSL talk at CUSA, so I encourage you to go see this online. We have an issue here. Level 0, every element has a cost, and this is driven by Bill Schindell's mindset that we want to have the smallest possible model of a system. Then we have, does the model conform to the language? So have we made a model consistent with the language expectations? This is the really important layer to me is are we following our method and is it well crafted? So this is where my 1.x validation rules tended to live enforcing this automatically. then can we execute it, verify it, does it meet the spec? So once we've conforming to the language and the method, now we have to make sure it actually verifies. And then there's all the downstream consumption. And the research is showing if anything's wrong, level 3 or below, any output you make from an LLM or anything else is going to be complete garbage. So it's really important to me that we exercise the level 2 really hard and work out the best ways to do this collectively as a community. So again, if we don't do that, our convergence falls apart and it's just absolutely wretched. So we don't want to do that. And so with that, legal is not necessarily well crafted. We need to make sure that we have validation to close the loop for humans and AI alike. And I think we're going to do a lot of really good work going forward in SysML 2. So this is the paper on my academia site. Lots of more content showing a lot of gibberish in English translated to SysML 2, and I think you'll find it interesting. So I invite you to go take a look at that. And so with that, I think I'm done. Thank you so much for your time and attention. And my hat's off to Airbus for doing the Apollo 11 model. It's really useful to have a large scale model to help us exercise that.